Thank you. Is Christianity a force for good? When Scott initially suggested this topic, I said, I'll probably agree with much of what you say. Scott will take the negative side. I expect he'll list some of the bad things that church or people have done in the name of Christ. I acknowledge that the church has done some bad things, but for the sake of time, I'll not cover these in my talk. I'll leave that to Scott, and we can talk about these things in the subsequent discussion. Instead, I'll present the case of why I believe that Christianity is a force for good. Right. The goodness of Christianity is embedded in its theological and ethical foundations. God is both transcendent and yet immanent. Transcendent means that God is separated from his creation. So Christianity is not pantheist. But God is also immanent or among us. So Christianity is not deist as well. Thus God is neither locked in nor locked out of his creation. God is also personal, all-knowing, all-powerful and all-good. Human beings are also made in the image of God and yet have fallen. Thus we are capable of greatness but also of evil. Then there's the ethical basis. Christianity is based on the teachings of Jesus. The greatest commandments are to love God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself. So our prime obligations are firstly to God and secondly to our neighbour. What does it mean to love your neighbour as yourself? Jesus gave us a golden rule. That is to treat others in the same way that you would like to be treated. The nature of love. Christians are called to love, but what does that mean? Paul describes what it means to love in his first letter to the Corinthians. He says that love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. There are plenty of other commands, such as showing the other cheek and enduring suffering, persecution and abuse. I think it's pretty obvious that if everyone behaved in this way, then the world would be a lot happier place. These are Christian aspirations, but the standards are demanding and we don't often meet them. So this led C.S. Lewis to say it this way: the problem with Christianity is not that it's been tried and found wanting, but it's been found hard and not tried. So, full of good intent, but does it work? Christianity has had an impact in many areas of life as listed here. I don't have time to cover them all, and so I'll address just a few, probably too many. Shortly after Jesus' death and resurrection, Jesus' followers went out and spread the gospel. They established Christian groups, which we call churches, in Judea and in major cities throughout the Roman Empire. They commenced this expansion about 30 AD from Jerusalem and had established churches even in Rome prior to 50 AD, in the midst of the Greek and pagan Roman culture. This culture was radically different from the Jewish culture and from our post-Christian culture now. And I'll describe what this culture was like as I go. Right from the beginning, the Bible places a high value on human beings. It says that humans are made in the image of God and are inherently valuable. In the first chapter of Genesis it says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." Being in the image of God was a foreign concept to Greek-Roman society and most other societies, which I'll illustrate with a couple of examples. Infanticide is the killing of unwanted babies. It was legal and commonly practiced throughout the Roman Empire. This particularly applied to deformed children and was more common for females. Christians called infanticide murder. It was forbidden in a didache, which is an extra biblical document just after the New Testament. It was eventually outlawed by the Christian Roman Emperor Valentinian I in AD 374. Abandoning children. Similarly, exposure or abandonment was where children were left to die. Christians adopted, abandoned and deformed children and were sometimes persecuted for doing so, as recorded by Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian and Lactantius. Abandonment was also eventually outlawed by Valentinian I in the same year. Gladiatorial shows. Gladiatorial shows were public entertainment where gladiators fought to the death against each other or against ferocious animals. The practice was introduced in 264 BC. It was considered top entertainment. The Roman emperors delighted in bloody deaths, in particular Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius and Nero. The practice was condemned by Christians and they were ridiculed for doing so. Eventually the practice was terminated by the Christian Emperor Theodosius in 395. Treatment of women. Christianity has had a huge impact on the treatment of women. I'll compare the attitudes of different groups as listed here. First of all, the Greeks. Greek women were not allowed to leave their house unaccompanied, not permitted to eat with male guests. They were kept under lock and key and only had the social status of a slave. They were not permitted to speak in public, deemed inferior to men and were equated with evil. Only the male could divorce and only males went to school. Roman women. The situation for Roman women was similar, but they had more freedom than the Greeks and more educational opportunities. But a woman was not permitted to eat with male guests. Her husband owned her and had complete control of all her possessions. The husband could divorce her, but she could not divorce him. The woman had limited property and inheritance rights. She was prohibited from speaking in public and could not speak in court. The Romans also had a law called patria potestas, which means the power of the father. The paterfamilias was the head of the Roman family, was the oldest living male. He had autocratic authority over his wife and all of his male descendants. He had the legal right to exercise capital punishment. Thus he had the right to kill his wife, his children, or his grandchildren. Hebrew women. Hebrew women could not testify in court. They were barred from public speaking and could not speak in public with men. They could not recite the law in public. Women and men were separated in the synagogue and women were silent. The Gospels and women. The situation within Christian circles was radically different. Jesus' treatment of women was scandalous by the standards of his time. He spoke to a Samaritan woman in public, a Samaritan and a woman. Jesus taught women and they were among his followers. When Jesus was crucified, his male disciples abandoned him for fear. Only the women were at the cross, and so they are the primary witness of those events. All Gospels record that women were the first witnesses to the empty tomb and the first to see the appearances. This was scandalous as women's testimony was not deemed trustworthy. The Apostolic period. Christian attitudes to women can be observed in Acts and the Apostles' letters. During this period, women were house church leaders, deacons and fellow workers. Phoebe led the church at a town called Cenchrea and also took Paul's letter to Rome. Women had the same access to baptism and the Lord's Supper as the men. Women also had equal access to salvation. Paul says there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. Appeal to women. During the post-apostolic period, Christianity appealed greatly to women. Women were often more active than men, and many of the martyrs were women. Christians were about 60% female. Celsus was an opponent of Christianity, and he ridiculed Christianity, saying because Christianity attracted women. In fact, often the wife became a Christian, but not the husband, and this was a cause of family instability. Unfortunately, the institutional church reverted somewhat to the Greek-Roman practice and excluded women from some leadership roles. What was the impact? Well, the Christian Emperor Valentinian I repealed Patria Potestas in 374 AD. Women were granted guardianship over children. There was a decline in child brides. Women could choose their husbands. But the church still supported veils, and veiling declined only after 1000 AD. After the Roman era, there were other advances made in other cultures at much later times. In India, sutti was banned and widows could remarry. In China, the practice of foot binding was abolished. Clitoro, also called female circumcision, is the removal of the clitoris. It is banned in Western cultures, even though it's still practiced elsewhere. Charity. Christians have always been encouraged to show charity towards others. Jesus' words are, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." And Paul says, each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. This was quite a contrast when compared with Roman culture. Romans mainly gave when they expected something in return. This was called liberalitas. There were rare exceptions. There was little compassion shown to the poor and sick. Even Plato believed that a poor sick man should be left to die. During plagues, the sick were deserted to avoid the risk of catching the same disease. By contrast, Christians gave without expecting return. This was called caritas, from which we get charity. Tertullian states that the early Christians gave 10% of their income to a common fund that was used for supporting widows, physically disabled, orphans, sick, prisoners incarcerated for their faith, teachers, burial for poor, and the release of slaves. This was not just applied to their own communities, they gave to Christians and pagans alike. Julian the Apostate was a pagan Roman emperor. For him, the generosity of Christians was a problem. He said, "The impious Galileans relieve both their own poor and ours. It is shameful that ours should be left so destitute of our assistance." Orphans. Romans cared not for orphans, but Christians took deserted children into their homes. Godparents were appointed at baptism in case the parents died. Orphanages were established after 313 AD, usually next to cathedrals. And just a note here that we're in Table College. Table College is now a tertiary college, but it was once an orphanage. It was called the Goodwood Orphanage, which was a Catholic orphanage founded by none other than Mary MacKillop. Care for the aged. Amongst the poor, the aged were killed or left to die. Christians looked after the aged, and eventually homes for the aged were introduced by churches at the time of Justinian. None existed before this. Hospitals. In the Greek-Roman world, no care was provided for the sick except for soldiers, for obvious reasons. But Christians supported the sick even prior to the Edict of Milan, when Christianity was legalised. At the Council of Nicaea, an edict was issued to establish a hospice in every cathedral city. The first hospital was established by Basil of Cappadocia in 396. Christians introduced nursing, which was firmly established by the 6th century. Nursing and hospitals grew rapidly in the following centuries, which was mainly sponsored by Christians. Florence Nightingale was an icon of nursing. She was a dedicated nurse and also a great organiser. And Jean Henry Durant formed the Red Cross. Both these people were Christians. Education. In Greek-Roman culture, education was only provided for privileged boys. In the 2nd century, Justin Martyr established catechetical schools. Every Christian school taught theology, early Christian schools taught theology, trades, mathematics and medicine. Christians were the first to provide schools for both boys and girls, even though they retained some cultural bias, such that there were more males than females who had access to schools. Women were employed in scriptoria for copying manuscripts, which was quite an educational activity. Universal education was initially for adults, but spread to children by the 4th century. In the 16th century, Martin Luther and John Calvin promoted a publicly funded state school system and universal education, and Luther believed that education should be compulsory. The first public schools in Germany were initiated by Philip Melanchthon. Subsequently, Christians were responsible for kindergartens, graded education, education for deaf and blind, the Braille technique, and Sunday schools taught children to read as well. Universities. The Greeks and Romans certainly had a great number of great thinkers, such as Thales, Xenophanes, Parmenides, etc. I won't read them all. But does that mean that this explains the origin of universities? However, they had no permanent institutions. It never went anywhere. No libraries, students or certification, nor did they conduct empirical research. These grew out of Christian monasteries. In the 6th century, St. Benedict established libraries, such that he is called the godfather of libraries. His libraries held both Christian and secular books. Universities commenced in the 11th and 12th centuries. The University of Bologna in 1158 initially taught canon law, but empirical research on cadavers commenced after 1300. The University of Paris was established in 1200, where they taught theology and medicine. In the US, every college that was established prior to the Civil War was established by some church institution. The origins of science. While the Greeks did some impressive things, their efforts faded and died. The essence of Greek science relied on deductive reasoning. Modern science is based on empirical observations and repeatable tests. This was initiated by 2 Franciscan friars, Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon, in the 13th century. This was further promoted by Francis Bacon, who is called the practical creator of scientific induction. The development of modern scientific theory is derived from medieval theology. In reality, the monk was the intellectual ancestor of the scientist. Christianity provided the intellectual basis for science. There is one rational God, and humans are made in his image. God is distinct from the physical world, so Christianity is not pantheistic. The universe is governed rationally by discoverable laws. Copernicus, Kepler and Galileo believed that the purpose of science was to understand the world that God had created. From the 13th century onwards, every scientist explained his motives in religious terms. Astronomy. These are all subsets of science, of course. All of the major early astronomers were Christian. Copernicus was a Catholic, but was sponsored by the Lutherans. Tycho Brahe was a Lutheran, and Johannes Kepler initially studied to be a Lutheran pastor. Kepler proposed his 3 laws of planetary motion and many other discoveries. He stated that science is thinking God's thoughts after him. Galileo was always a loyal Catholic. He wrote the dialogue on the 2 principal systems of the world in 1632. The Royal Society of London was a key organisation for promoting science. It was established by Calvinists in the year 1645. Physics. The greatest early physicists were all Christians. Isaac Newton is widely regarded as the greatest of all scientists. He was a Christian. He wrote more on the Bible than on science. All of his writings, including those on religion, are available on a website called the Newton Project. Gottfried Leibniz was a Lutheran. James Clerk Maxwell was an evangelical Presbyterian and elder in his church. Blaise Pascal and Lord Kelvin were also devout believers. Most of the greatest mathematicians were Christians, as listed here. My mathematics textbook was called Advanced Engineering for Mathematics by Kreutzig, I remember it well. My mathematics textbook was dominated by Euler, Gauss and Cauchy. I had to put this in, I'm an electrical engineer, all right? The fundamental equation for electrical engineering is V equals IR. If you know that, you can pass all your electrical engineering. The units of these quantities are volts, amps and ohms, named after Volta, Ampere and Ohm, all Christians. Michael Faraday made many discoveries related to electrical engineering. He is widely regarded as the greatest experimentalist. He was also an elder in the Sandemanian Foot Washers Church. Chemistry and medicine. This slide lists a number of the greatest scientists in chemistry and medicine, all of whom were Christians. I won't read them all out. Won't read any of them out. Conclusion on science. Experimental science did not start in other cultures. It arose out of Christian theology. Well over half of the greatest scientists were Christians, and this is well documented. However, this awareness is suppressed or not mentioned much within current educational institutions. Art. Christian influence has been highly significant in the arts, which has enriched our culture. Art in churches accelerated after Constantine legalised Christianity, and Western art has been highly influenced by Christian themes. Great works of biblically based art were supported and displayed in Western churches and cathedrals. Great Renaissance artists were Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael and Rembrandt. Many of the great masterpieces had Christian themes. Great art is dominated by artists who were inspired by Christ. Architecture. Christianity has also had a great influence on architecture. After Constantine, church buildings were based on the Roman basilica. The Romanesque design was commenced in the 11th century, and Gothic architecture commenced in the 12th century. Gothic architecture is quite stunning and inspirational. It may seem extravagant when you see how big it is and all the intricate detail, but it has amazed people for 1,000 years. When you consider its longevity, it's probably a good bang for the buck. Music. After Constantine, Ambrose introduced, yes, those are the sections I'll be going through, early church. The Romans made no significant progress in music. Prior to Constantine, information on Christian music is fairly sparse. But Christians initially sang psalms, hymns and spiritual songs in the Jewish tradition. Pliny recorded that Christians sang songs to Christ as God, and the early church fathers recorded Christian singing habits and music composition. The Middle Ages. After Constantine, Ambrose introduced antiphonal choral sings. That's where they sing on two sides and sing to each other. He wrote the hymn, O Splendour of God's Glory Bright, and the Ambrosian chant, both of which are still sung today. The rest of this slide lists the development of various types of music, all strongly influenced by Christians. The Gregorian chant, or plain song, was developed in the 6th century. In the 9th century, they started doing church operas, such as Visitatio Sepulchri. Polyphonic was introduced in 9th century and reached its peak with Johann Sebastian Bach. Arezzo was the person who introduced the musical staff, which allowed people to record instrumental music. In the 13th century, motets, or polyphonic voice and instruments, was introduced and later developed by Bach and Mozart. In the 14th century, there were madrigals introduced, polyphonic songs with religious texts and prayers. In 16th century, they introduced the anthem and the oratorio, and the symphony evolved from Giovanni Gabrieli in the late 1500s, who also originated the sonata. In the 17th century, they developed the cantata, and later on in the 17th century, the concerto. Originally church overtures before Mass, and the people who developed these were Bach, Beethoven, Handel and Mozart. Martin Luther had a significant influence on music. He introduced congregational singing by lay people in their native tongue rather than having music just sung by choirs, and he wrote 36 hymns. Johann Sebastian Bach is considered to be either number one or number two composer of all time. He had strong Lutheran convictions and was a prolific composer. Albert Einstein said his greatness has not been surpassed, nor can ever be. George Friedrich Handel was also a German Lutheran who was born in the same year, 1685. He was a prolific composer, including many that were explicitly Christian or biblically based. While composing the Messiah, he said, "I did think I see all heaven before me," and the great God himself. Other great Christian composers were Mozart, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Haydn, Schubert, Brahms and Stravinsky. As well as this, the churches and the royal courts cooperated in sponsoring the composers to enable them to exercise their talents. And one historian has said the history of Western art music properly begins with the music of the Christian church. Well, that's all history. How does it affect us now? A Christian experiences friendship and encouragement through his local church. We have guidance, hope, meaning, purpose and direction. Death has lost its sting. I find it interesting and fun, and for me it is overwhelmingly good. So Christianity was crucial to virtually all of the good things about Western culture. But these values are now taken for granted and their roots are suppressed or forgotten. Even though we've taken Western values for granted, they are not self-evident, as they have not arisen where Christianity has little influence. Other cultures have since copied Western culture because of its benefits. So the Christian influence has permeated the whole world. Christianity is not just a force for good. Christianity, or Christ, is the predominant force for good. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation with me. I don't have copious amounts of notes with me tonight, but I do have a very brief outline that I wrote at about 5 p.m. this evening. Work has been quite hectic, so I won't be going 28 minutes, but I do have a lot of experience standing up in front of groups of people, some of them hostile, some of them friendly, and talking about atheism and many other topics. I'd first like to start off by talking about the organisation that I'm from, the Atheists Foundation of Australia. It was founded in 1970 here in Adelaide. It came out of the Rationalist Society of South Australia. They got to a point where they felt just straight rationalism wasn't enough to define who they were, as a label to describe what they were all about. So they picked the deliberately provocative term atheism. At that time, in the US, Madalyn Murray O'Hair had been making quite a few waves. Some recordings of hers giving his speeches and orations had made their way over, and they gathered at a hall just in Wayville and listened to those recordings in those times. I mention this because 2 weekends ago I was going through the AFA's storage locker in Keswick and found the magazines from 1969, 1970, 1971, tracking that change, tracking that thought process that a group of people went through to describe who they are. Since then, the Atheists Foundation has been an organisation wanting to promote reason, scientific thinking, critical thinking. And throughout the years, it's done that to varying degrees of success. In 2010, it held the very first Global Atheist Convention in Melbourne with attendees of 2,500 people. In 2012, they held it again with attendees approaching close to 4,000. Since then, it's held a campaign, you might remember this, in 2011 and again in 2016 around the census. And question 19 on the census form, what is the person's religion? And the Atheists Foundation, together with some other secular societies, spearheaded a campaign to promote the option of no religion that was put all the way down the bottom of that question, in contradiction to the way all of the other questions in the census are formatted. When they ask if they're for their marital status, the very first option is never married. When they ask for religion, their very first option was Catholic, not the non-version. So that's since changed. You might remember in the 2016 census, no religion was brought up to the top. And that simple fact alone led to so many more people in Australia identifying as not having a religion. So that's just some of the achievements of the Atheists Foundation. I've also been here before presenting to your group, and that was on the topic of humanism. I'm a former secretary and president of the Council of Australian Humanist Societies and the South Australian Humanists. So myself, I'm a humanist, I'm an atheist, and I like to believe I'm a rational thinker. But we all have our biases. So what is atheism, first off? It is simply the answer to this one question. Do you have a belief in a God? If you answer yes, that's okay, you're who you are. If your answer is no, or I don't know, you're an atheist. You don't have a belief in a God, you're an atheist. How you put that into practice is entirely up to you, is entirely up to me. I'm someone, I use that label to describe myself. Other people don't, they'll use the term agnostic or I don't know, and that's perfectly fine. We live in a pluralistic society, and that pluralism, that diverse set of views, has created the world that we are in today. I'll just now move to the actual question. Is Christianity a force for good? As Kevin said, when we were originally discussing it, I first proposed the idea, is organised religion a force for good? Kevin wanted to narrow it down a little bit, just to an area which he knows most about, Christianity. And in his presentation, I heard him rattle off a long list of things which Christians did, things that Christians achieved, things that Christians progressed. There's no denying those facts, no denying them at all. It's well researched, well evidenced. Any person that denies that Christians did those things is a lunatic. But I would contend that those people, those fantastic geniuses, would have done those things anyway, whether or not Christianity was the dominant force in their world. What happened? Just touching on a couple of the things, the sciences, the arts. Christianity was the institution, was the governing body, was the thing that controlled everything. If you wanted to do anything, it was inside of their framework. But now to the actual question, is Christianity a force for good? I want to look to the future because, as Kevin said in an email to me, the past is the past. It's happened. So we need to look to the future. What is going to be a force for good in society today? And to decide whether or not Christianity can be a force for good, we do need to look to its past, but more often than not, the recent past is going to be a better determinant for whether or not Christianity is going to be a force for good in the near future. I don't have to list off all of the bad things that organised Christianity has done, but I will. And I'm sure you probably know of, you might even know of personal stories where the organised churches have failed, where human beings have failed, and stories where human beings have succeeded and have been brilliant inspirations for those around them. But we cannot deny that the organised Christian churches failed appallingly in the protection of children, in the protection of those that were infirm, in the protection of those that were just unable to protect themselves, and also in the protection of those that could protect themselves, but because of the structure that they found themselves in, they felt they were unable to. And we just recently had a Royal Commission here in Australia into those failures. So the church has failed in the recent past, and those probably extend further back, but we just don't know. We just don't know, because we don't have records. We can't go in and truly research and discover it. But what we can do is look at what the Christian church is doing now. What is Christianity doing now? Has it changed? Is it changing? And I contend that it isn't. Not really, not yet. Because we look at the recent events in Rome with the Catholic Church, and they had a large gathering to talk about their institutional response to pedophilia in the church and what they should do about it. And they decided, yeah, it's bad. It's a bad thing that it happened. It's a bad thing that it happens. We don't want it to happen. We never wanted it to happen. But we're not going to change. We're not going to change our fundamental practices, which would actually help prevent hurting children in the future. Fundamental practices which helped priests hide their pedophilic tendencies. So that's one church. That's one church. And we see it also here in Australia with the Catholic Church not wanting to give up the sanctity of the confessional when someone comes to them and confesses that they are a pedophile. They do not want to give that up. They do not want to have the legal responsibility to go and report that to the police, to go and make a mandatory report. Other churches in Australia, some of the smaller churches, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and they're the ones that I'm positive of. Again, they have reacted against the findings against them to ignore it. So we're not going to change. We're not going to do anything about it. Some other churches, I'm not completely across what the Anglican Church is doing, but it's going to be somewhere in between. There is no church out there actively going, we're going to change fundamentally what we're doing for the protection of children, for the protection of those in our care. That's not happening. Individual Christians, and I'm sure every single Christian in this room, wants something to change, wants their faith to be practiced in the organised setting to protect those vulnerable people. But the organisation that claims to represent you isn't doing anything. And they're the ones with the power, at least at the moment. And so that's not changing. So I'm left to assume, I'm left to believe that Christianity isn't going to be a force for good, at least in the near future. Not until the rank and file, the grassroots movements, really kick up a stink and say, no, we want you, our representatives, our supposed conduit to God, depending on which religion, which sect you belong to, we want you to change. We want you to actually practice what you preach. Until that happens, Christianity is not a force for good in this world. Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome back everybody. We've had two interesting addresses tonight and presenting very alternative views. It's now open to everybody here to participate if they choose to do so, to ask a question of one or both of the speakers or to make a comment.
Can I just ask one thing? Can you just kind of give us a little bit of your personal background?
Yeah.
And why you headed in this direction?
Certainly. I did actually have that on my notes to talk about in my speech, but I skipped over that. Didn't put the flow. So myself, I was raised in what's best termed as a secular household. Religion wasn't talked about. Christmas happened, Easter happened. I knew the Christmas story, I knew the Easter story, but it wasn't, didn't go to church, didn't even go to church on special occasions or anything like that. My first experience with a religious ceremony was when I was in primary school. I went to Spence Primary, now Tivoli Primary. And at that point in time, it was one of 4 schools sharing a common campus up in Atheists Park. There was Spence, Hyson, 2 government schools. There was Pilgrim, an independent Uniting school, and Nativity, a Catholic school. And Nativity, one Easter, I want to say it was 1992, 93, I was in year 2 or year 3, put on the Stations of the Cross outside, and the entire campus came out to support them in their endeavour. And I just remember being stuck in the middle of the quadrangle. We were all standing packed in, looking over the top of many, many heads that were taller than me, and just seeing this cross being carried all the way around as they did the Stations of the Cross. My next experience was at Kids Club at the Southern Hills Baptist Church, again up in Atheists Park, where I grew up. So I would have been year 4, year 5, and doing fun creative activities on a Thursday night after school, and then every second week or so they would have a prayer. Kids would all bow their heads, and I'd be left wondering, who are you talking to? Kind of thing. It just felt really foreign to me. I hadn't really experienced anything like that before. Then went on to the youth group, because made friends and still staying in touch with those friends and doing those things. The prayer and whatnot became much less, but there was still a little bit of it, and I still felt this doesn't do anything for me. It wasn't until the start of university that I started actively reading up about other faiths and whatnot, and I discovered atheism via an American cable community access cable TV show, The Atheist Experience, out of Austin, Texas. Some of you may or may not be aware of that organisation. They have an incredibly long playlist on YouTube of all of their shows they've been doing weekly or monthly. I forget if it's weekly or monthly. Shows for the last 19, 20 years on their community access cable channel. With Christian and atheist calling. It was a call-in show. And so that's when I learned about the term atheism and went, that's me. That's what I am. And then very quickly after that, I joined Godless at Adelaide University, which has since renamed themselves, rebranded themselves as a secular society. And from there, started going on to an Adelaide Atheist meetup group here, and then joining up with SA Humanists, and now with the Atheists Foundation of Australia. So that's been my journey.
Hey, can I just ask something, Scott? It's interesting. You know, everyone's got a history of where they come from and where they are now. Have you read the entire Bible?
No.
Have you read the New Testament?
No.
Have you read the Gospels? Yeah, you've read bits. Now, have you read the entire Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
So I haven't read the entire things, but there's one thing for me. I mean, you might ask why I haven't. Yeah. Why haven't I read it?
Well, have you read James Patterson?
Say again?
Have you read James Patterson?
Who's James Patterson?
Exactly so.
No, it's not. That's not quite equivalent.
No, it's not.
You know,
so
I've read very widely actually, but I don't know who you're talking about.
And that isn't the point. The Bible, I do not deny the influence that the Bible and Christian stories have had on literary achievements and all those sorts of things, and the inspiration there. It's been a fixture in Western society for a long time. That longevity doesn't imbue it with any sort of sense of truth. For me, I want to know, okay, it says some stuff, but why should I believe it? It might say some brilliant things about how to treat your fellow human being.
But you haven't actually read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, for example.
But what is its veracity? There isn't, for me, there isn't any veracity behind it. It would be no different to saying, have you read Lord of the Rings?
Yes, I have.
And say, well, if you haven't read it, then why don't you read it and then believe it? So for me, and that might sound a little bit facetious, but there's no evidence supporting it as non-fiction.
You don't read
Debate
non-fiction?
on that?
So
We're digressing a little bit.
but also it then comes back to whether or not. I always go back to, if you want me to accept the Bible, prove that your God is real first. And before you can prove your God is real first, you need to prove that a God exists. And if that all lines up, and it is the Christian God and the Bible is his unerring word of truth, then okay, I'll accept that it's God's unerring word of truth. But that doesn't exist there for me.
And what would it take to prove to you as a person?
Evidence.
What evidence?
Verifiable evidence. Something that other people can go in and investigate and go, yes, this is correct. This is undisputable evidence. Not like people often say the Bible is hearsay and all that sort of stuff, which to varying degrees and varying interpretations it is. And for some people, that's enough, and that's okay. That's perfectly fine. I'm not here to change your minds, not at all. As I said during my talk, that the pluralistic society that we are in today is a much better society than any society that existed in the past. And it's because of that plurality of views. With no one group asserting control over others, we are in a better position today than ever before in history.
Going back to what was actually said tonight, Kevin, you spent quite some time talking about various things that Christians have done over the course of centuries and all the things that went into it, and you put this down to the Christian background behind it, saying that other cultures didn't do that sort of thing, and it was when Christians came in that those things were put in place. Then Scott, you were saying that, well, Christianity, no Christianity, those people were good people, they would have done that anyway. But then you came on to talk about bad things that Christians have done, and you sheeted that home Christianity. Isn't that inconsistent? Rather than saying those people were just bad people anyway, they would have done that irrespective?
You're right, they would have done that irrespective, whatever the institutions were. But the question tonight was that Christianity is a force for good. If Christianity is a force for good, it should be able to exert influence over those bad people.
When you were discussing about the pedophilic nature of the churches and that sort of stuff, were you referring to Christianity or were you referring to the doctrine and religion of the church not being changed?
I believe I said the organised religions.
And
It's
they're
very
not willing
easy.
to change.
Yeah.
It's very easy to confuse the two, Paul. Yeah.
But they're what have influence on society today. They are what has influence on
Oh, they're
politics.
recognised leaders.
Yeah,
of
but
Christianity.
they're what
sure.
have influence on society today. Your ordinary lay Christian, like the people here in this room, don't have as much influence on society as your Australian Christian lobby, as the Catholic Church, as your Anglican Archdiocese. That's just a fact. So that is the current embodiment of Christian power in today's society.
Oh, but we're trying.
Yeah, and fantastic.
Do you think, though, it's a symptom of our extreme wealth and we're closeted from the other parts? Like in South America, for example, the Catholic Church is actually, there are martyrs there who have stood up against the generals and promoted, the well-being of the poor, etc., etc. And so we're really talking about our society, not necessarily the good that the other, even Catholic Church has done, or definitely the Catholic Church has done, because they've done what Christ taught of helping others. So it's actually symptomatic of our society, not only whether we're secular or Christian, but we allow whatever's happened. I don't think we're necessarily we're comfortable, but would we be able to stand up to somebody coming in and really, a general or something? Could we actually have something happen where we just simply drift into it and be a secular society because we don't actually know what we quite believe in?
I'd say no, we wouldn't have that situation here. But to touch
But
on
why
the
not?
Catholic,
Yeah.
I will.
Yeah, sorry.
To touch on the Catholic Church in South America, they're having their own pedophilic priest scandals.
Of course, but that's
so
you're picking on a very small part that is actually part of the whole society,
but no, so
or
the institution.
institutionalised society.
But that's where power is. That's where power is expressed in its institutions. That's where it's fundamentally expressed, and it's the case in the government institutions too, the secular government institutions too. When that power was being expressed, it wasn't protecting children. But we've seen today that we can make governments and those institutions change. That's not necessarily happening in religious
It
institutions.
is actually. That's
Some, yeah.
Yeah.
I do not dispute that. But the ones that have the power and the influence in today's society, here in Australia in particular, in the US, in the UK, they are not.
So you're saying the bulk of them are doing the wrong thing, it's just a few of the powerless people that are wanting to do the right thing?
Perhaps.
Not so much that they're stoic in their ways and not willing to change.
But it comes down to wanting to protect institutional reputation. And that's the case with all of them.
Yeah, but as I mentioned before, like in my own church, they've changed. They have child protection procedures as a result of this. And I used to be an elder, and I had police checks, then I had to attend conferences, and always I thought, I'm too busy, so I pulled out. But all the rest of them are actually going through all these conferences and child protection. So it is happening. But of course, if they do that, it doesn't hit the papers.
Yeah.
It's only when people do wrong that it hits the papers, and you don't get any brownie points for whatever you do wrong.
No, but...
Because I'd say there are changes going on.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. But when you look at the larger institutions, they're the ones that aren't, and they're the ones that have the power.
Yeah, a lot of abuse has happened too in non-religious institutions. The ones that seem to be targeted are religious institutions, but a great deal of abuse has happened in state institutions,
I did say that.
and also in old folks' homes as well.
Said that.
Quite non-religious old folks' homes, where wherever there are vulnerable people, there's an opportunity. There's for some to abuse that, and so definitely safeguards need to be put in place to protect the vulnerable, whether they're children or whether they're the very elderly, so on. I think it's a bit unfair to target, religious institutions here. when it's a much more widespread problem.
But is it really? Because these institutions hold themselves up as the paragon of morality.
Yeah.
Is it unfair to target an institution that upholds itself as the paragon of morality and they commit those vile cover-ups?
Yeah, I think it's terrible. I really do. And from my point of view, as a committed Christian, the sad thing is, this is told in the New Testament. People who do such things bring the name of Christ into disrepute, and that's exactly what happens. People, generally would say, because of some instance of this, and it's been some evil's been perpetrated by a Christian or a Christian group. They say, well, there can't be anything in Christianity. This is exactly the subject tonight. And so, from my point of view of myself and many others like me, that's very, very sad, because it's bringing it's bringing Christ's name into disrepute. That's been the case since the year dot. Those sort of things do happen.
That might upset you viscerally. But that's the society we're in now. And unfortunately, we all have to come to terms with that. Every single one of us. Myself, who believes in secular institutions, I have to come to terms with the fact that secular institutions failed in the past.
Yeah, but with this, there's failing of human society. Generally, every human society has these failings, and have done through time. I heard an interview not long ago. It was one of John Anderson's conversations, which I thoroughly recommend to anybody. John Anderson was the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. He's got all these lengthy conversations with notable people. And he had one with Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you know Jordan Peterson. He's a professor of psychiatry or something or other in a Canadian university.
He's all the flavour of the month.
He is a bit of the flavour of the month. But he had a lengthy interview at length by John Anderson. And he talked about Nazi Germany, and he said that people are absolutely horrified when it's been revealed what went on in Germany, the persecution, particularly the Jews, but more than the Jews, lots of other people as well, but centred on the Jews. People like to imagine that if I was in that case, I'd be like the Corrie ten Boom. I'd hide some of these Jews. He said that is a fiction. That's a myth. The vast, overwhelming majority of people just comply. Just comply with evil. When evil happens on a societal level like that, most people think, oh, it's terrible, they shouldn't be doing this, but they comply. And there'll be an absolute unique individual who stands out against that, because they risk their own life, they risk their family's life, they risk their children and everything, in order to save one Jew or one person who's the object of this persecution. And that is, that happens in modern Western society, in an advanced country like Germany. And it's a myth that we think, oh yeah, well I'll stand, I'd be brave and do the right thing. When evil gets institutionalised, people fall in with it.
I'll let David speak now, but I'm not sharing the minute.
When push comes to shove, you do what you do.
Say again?
So when push comes to shove,
yep,
and you're put in a situation,
yeah,
then you will do what you do. While you might have these ideals, I'll be like Corrie ten Boom, I'll be like this person, I'll be like this person. When push comes to shove, and you're put in a situation,
your life will be on the line if you do.
Then and your life is on the line, then you will do what you do.
Yeah.
Whether it be right or wrong is irrespective.
Yeah. Well, the vast majority of people
you will do what you do.
Most majority of people just go along with the what they perceive
precisely
as being
because they have hope in their safety of numbers.
Anyway,
Just
Dave. Sorry, Dave.
Okay.
Sorry. The question goes something like this. You were saying that the Christian church today, as an example of wrongdoing with the covering up of pedophilia, if it was a force for good, then in a self-governing way, it would act in an appropriate and responsible way, and that's that governance that it would show to eradicate it or completely minimise it, would show that it was a force for good, and therefore that would be that, right? So, and I think that that's a fair line of argument. What I wanted to ask you was, is that it from your perspective? So in other words, supposing the Christian, a sufficient number of the Christian churches, you can see where I'm going with this, and they eradicated the, in this particular case, pedophilia and blah, 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 would you go, actually, and we invited you back, in a year's time, and Kevin did his thing back up there, and we had another debate, and we got to the same thing, we said, hey, you remember, would you then go, actually, guys, you know what, Christianity is a force of good because of the radical thing, or would you go, well, actually, I've got another one in.
That's a fair question.
It is a fair question, and you're right, tonight, for the purpose of the question that we were debating tonight, I did pick on one thing. And everyone does it. Everyone does it. It's a rhetorical instrument that everyone uses. Kevin used it himself tonight, focusing on only good things.
Yeah.
No, that's his job.
But,
But lots of good things. Yeah.
but so to come to the fundamental question of, if Christian churches did that one thing, would I then feel that they were a force for good? On the balance, no. But this is just me personally, on my own sense of morality and ethics. I think at this point in time, the Christian church and organised religions in general, be they Christian or other religions, have too much baggage at the moment for them to be given a clean slate with one good act. That long-standing history, crusades, witch trials, all of it throughout history,
So,
all of the bad things that happen throughout history carries a lot of baggage, so it would take a long time to wipe that slate.
You would say, I'm putting it in my words, but you'd say something else would come along. Is that right? And
Not necessarily something else.
If
they started acting in complete accordance with every good thing in the Bible and none of the bad things, then for me personally, it would take them a long time to build that trust back up. That they'll be heading towards it. They'll be heading towards it, and that's a good thing. I can only encourage that. But for me personally, on whether or not I could say, okay, you've done enough good, you're now a force for good, is...
Hang on. I'll give it to you.
Okay. Yeah, I think Kevin did an amazing job putting all sorts of wonderful history together like that. And I'd love to get a hard copy of that. There's lots of different ways I could use that, I think, in other conversations in the future and so on.
It'll be on YouTube now, right?
Okay, and the big worry, as far as I'm concerned, is that the force for good, which is still very strong in virtually all Christian churches in charitable ways and in helping people get out of highly immoral, crime-ridden sort of lives. There's a lot of evangelism still going on, which is doing a lot of good. But there's also, because more and more people are becoming atheists, we're becoming a pagan society, and there's ways that Christianity or that our society is going backwards. And I've listed a few here, in my opinion, that the moral standards in our community, especially young people, this is the big issue we've really got to face. Morality is going backwards, that popular music is going backwards. It's hard to imagine that somebody like the Seekers
maybe ageism rather than...
Yeah, I mean, that's not a big issue, but the Seekers were wonderful, sort of wholesome sort of music only 50 years ago, and now it's all this rubbish. Things like evolution is becoming entrenched in the schools as if it's fact. It's only a theory, and it's a ridiculous theory in my opinion. There's very good sites where you can sort of disprove that. Infanticide is coming back in, if you don't mind. Where it won't be long before you can kill babies that are a few days old and so on. It's just crazy stuff. Euthanasia, where, it's getting to the stage where we'll soon be able to encourage our old folks to do themselves in so that we get better inheritances and all that sort of thing. That gay marriage and all that is just totally wrong as far as I'm concerned. Gay and lesbian Mardi Gras is becoming more and more popular, and sort of folks encouraging young people to get interested in that sort of thing. profanity. You go to any movies just about these days and you've got all this foul language and so on. So my point is that I think we may have peaked about 50 years ago, and that now we're under more and more pressure, and that the wonderful things that Christianity has done over the last 2,000 years is going to be slowly diminished, except in those two areas
Can I just ask?
I'm only addressing that to Kevin about whether he thinks that's the case.
Can I just ask?
You've had enough, probably. I was just going to ask Kevin whether he thinks that's the case.
Scott wants to.
All right.
Can I ask?
I'll let Scott ask.
Okay, first off, if don't mind me being rude, how old are you?
I'm 75.
So you're talking about when you're about 25, when you're in your heyday.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
In the good old days.
Exactly. Every person, every generation, sorry, let me start again. Every senior generation throughout time has said exactly the same thing.
Have they been right?
Never. Never. The older generation, back when you were 25, were complaining about everything that your generation was doing at that time. The generation that was complaining then was complaining about when they were young. The generation complaining then was complaining about the one before. All the way back. That is nothing new. You just feel out of touch and a lack of understanding about what's going on. And that's natural if you don't keep in touch with it. I very well, when I'm 75, I may complain. I may very well complain about the youth today, saying today was the heyday because our government institutions were responding to institutionalised abuse and all of the rest, and that's no longer happening 50 odd years down the track. To come to your other points, which you rattled off a lot of, evolution, a woman's right to choose, LGBTIQ people's right to love the people that they love. I'm sorry, I do not have time to entertain people with those opinions. We have moved on. Society has moved on. Evolution is a scientific fact.
It's a theory.
It is a scientific fact.
It is the one and only scientific fact in existence.
It is a scientific fact as much as science can prove it.
A lot of people, if you don't mind bumping in on that, a lot of people say, like the creation science people say, evolution is just a theory. That word "just" is wrong. A theory has the highest status in science, even over and above a fact, because a theory is being tested over and over again and is made public to people who can test it out and check it out and then correct it. Evolution has had 150 years of that, and that has never overthrown evolution. The facts are there. The new science, like of genetics, you could prove evolution happens from that alone, let alone the fossil remains. It's a thing that the church and old people, I'm 75, old people like us have got to get down and say, get with it, understand what's going on, and I'm talking just about evolution here. It's not any longer just a theory. It's a theory. It's never been overthrown in 150 years. And if the church doesn't get on with that and understand that, the only people who are going to be going to church, if I'll be rude here, are dummies who can't understand the bloody thing. That's what I believe would happen. So the church has got to get real with it and start having their congregation understanding.
I think this could open up a board.
Yeah, I think they should go off the subject. Something off the subject.
It's sort of the question that I'm going to sort of ask is, I tend to agree that the church is in danger of becoming irrelevant, or Christianity rather, not the church, because we're distinguishing between institutionalised Christianity and Christianity, and I think Christians in the pews sometimes have more wisdom than what the people that are teaching us. And I think the wisdom of the church is that hopefully will actually go and reach people. It's my understanding from, even though, I don't know, 15-20% of us may go to church, that the majority of people still believe in a God. And therefore, we're failing, in my opinion, so that's why I agree with you, of reaching them. And we're being influenced by the wrongdoings of a few, because many of, I mean, I know lots of, I come from a Protestant tradition, but many of my Catholic friends and that are really quite out there to help people. So it's the advertiser, or whoever it might be, you know, with the bad news sells and the good news doesn't. So the vast majority of Christians are actually out there doing good. And that's it's the bad press, and also not being able to work out how to reach the bigger group.
I mean, and I would contend that all those good people would still be good people, whether or not they had a Christian belief or not. I'd like to consider myself a good person, and I'm a good person without a Christian belief. I do not have a belief that God is watching me, judging my every move.
I don't have that view either, and I'm a Christian. But I'm saying you may have that view because, as Kevin points out with history, you're accepting that view without understanding where it wasn't always like that. And I'm a great believer in history.
So if humans weren't, if humans were innately bad people, we wouldn't have made it off of the savannah in Africa. I know the gentleman over there would disagree that we weren't there.
I would agree that we were probably there, so.
So we wouldn't have made it off of the savannah because we wouldn't have cooperated. So those things that are good about Christianity have evolved in humans because they are beneficial for our group survival. So that's an explanation for why we have these tendencies to cooperate, come together in groups of like-minded people to help and console and protect and support each other, which are brilliant things to do. And there are not enough places in secular society for that to occur beyond the sporting clubs, which is where most people get their sense of community from here in Australia.
And their sense of religion.
Yep. And I use that sense of religion, sense of community interchangeably, deliberately. Because think about why, for those of you here, go to church. It's the people that are there, that you see, you have your conversations with, you have these connections with, these friendships, these close partnerships, these people that share a common value system with you. It's that sense of community that's there.
That's one aspect of it.
That's correct.
And that aspect, Scott, is actually worldwide, because I've travelled the world.
Yeah.
I'll go to different churches, and while I may not necessarily agree with everything of what they do there, the way they dance or sing or whatever, the fundamental issues, or the fundamentals of it, is still the same worldwide.
Yeah, but there's more to it than that, but that is very important. I want to give the floor to this gentleman. David, if you would like to say something still.
Just to change tack a little bit, Scott, thank you for coming here. You know, so I think I consider it a brave move.
Stupid, please. I don't
But, and you may have partially answered this question already to your last answer, but I'm just interested in, from atheist philosophy, how do you assign good and bad to things? You know, how do you work that out?
So there's no atheist philosophy. As I said in my talk, atheism is just simply the answer to that one question: do you have a belief in a God?
So you use the terms good and bad a lot tonight.
Yep.
How do you decide what is good and bad?
So I'm a humanist. So I use atheism here to describe it, because it's an easy label to use. But humanism tells you a lot about what I actually believe. It's a positive label as opposed to just a missing label of atheism. So a humanist believes in the innate goodness, the innate capability of human beings to come together, cooperate and support each other. tied together with reason and inquiry and ethical thinking and scientific investigation and all those sorts of things, tempered with compassion. So the three-word slogan that I use for what humanism is reason, science, and compassion. And it's that compassion for another person. And that empathy is an evolved ability of human beings.
So it's just a chemical reaction, in other words.
Yes. And there's nothing wrong with it being a chemical reaction and being in awe of it. The fact that I can look across the room, I could look on your face and see you in pain, and I would empathise and feel that pain and want to help relieve that. And that is a chemical reaction happening in my brain because I'm seeing on David's face that pain and anguish. And so I would then feel it myself. It's my brain operating to the senses around it. And that's amazing. That's astounding to me, that simple chemical operations can produce that feeling in me, a conscious being, and vice versa.
But there's whole groups of people whose chemical reactions tell them that there's nothing wrong with paedophilia.
Yes.
You know, so is there?
Yes, there is something wrong with it.
Why?
Because children cannot consent.
What's that got to do with it? How does that make it bad?
Absolutely everything.
Isn't that just a
What
chemical
if they
reaction in
do
your brain?
consent? What if they do consent?
No.
That's not necessarily Christian.
What if they do consent?
Children cannot consent. They
Yes, they
do.
can.
You're saying a child can consent to having sex?
I'm sure they can in certain circumstances. Someone comes along and offers them some nice bribes, and they say, well, you'd like this, and I want this from you. And they say, yes, okay. And they do.
Is
That's
that
what
true?
happens, isn't it?
No. Is that true consent, though?
No, it's not.
That's being coerced. That's not true free consent. Being able to
It's
stop.
informed consent, I think. So,
Yes.
I know where you're going with it, but it's
But what's
Yeah, correct. It's not informed consent.
It still doesn't really answer whether something's good or bad.
You can't say it's a bad influence on society if you can't define it bad and good. That's the thing, I guess.
But you can't either, I think, if you're actually honest.
See, where is the atheist society going? Where are they now? Where are they going into the future? They're trying to change. They're trying to do what's the goal? Are they going somewhere? Or are they doing something? Or are they creating schools, orphanages? What's the goal?
So the Atheists Foundation of Australia intends to remain a bulwark against the any one particular religion taking advantage of our secular society for a privileged position. We don't have a privileged position. Because religions, atheists, no. And we do not want a privileged position. We do not want to push our non-belief on you. We do not want to go out there and convert you and take away what you feel is fundamentally you, that is intrinsic to the person that you are. Kevin wouldn't be Kevin without his beliefs. He wouldn't be the person that I like to consider a friend. He would not be that person. He would be a very different person if he suddenly stopped believing. I'd probably say, let's pop down to the hospital and get you checked out. You change your beliefs very quickly. Same as I heard Kevin say, hey Scott, let's go to the hospital and get you checked out. You've just suddenly changed overnight with absolutely no reason to. So we don't want that. We don't want to have a privileged position. We want you to be able to continue having your beliefs about how you should live your life. We don't want to be told how to live our life.
You've almost implied, though, we can't go out and evangelise. And that includes other religions as well. And convert you, perhaps, to religious belief.
So, I strongly believe that you should not be using the apparatus of the state to do that.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm sorry,
And so
I'm not disagreeing with you at all.
Yeah,
I'm
so
saying
that's what the Atheists Foundation is standing against. And there are organisations, there are Christian organisations that want to use the apparatus of the state to push their
But that's a long time past, I think, we find, and we're in we're in a different society.
Are you sure?
You know, we're heading...
SRE
Yeah.
in schools, school chaplains, you have to have a religious belief to be a chaplain in a school. That's a fundamental religious test on what should be a secular position. It doesn't matter whether or not the person has a belief. They could be fundamental belief Christianity, but they can still carry out the role of counsellor.
So I presume you don't have any problem with a Prime Minister being Christian?
No, I do not. And interesting you should raise that. There are two examples to look at how Australia reacted to Kevin Rudd and how Australia in general reacted to Tony Abbott. Both very committed Christians. Kevin Rudd regularly did doorstops on the steps of his church on his way out on Sunday morning. But Australia didn't mind that. Australia reacted very strongly against Tony Abbott, who didn't really hold up going to Catholic Mass and all the rest, and proudly displaying that, but he was actively trying to impose his own beliefs into law. And so Australia reacted to that. Kevin Rudd didn't, if we ignore the perpetuating the school chaplaincy, but as far as most Australians are concerned, chaplaincy isn't that big of an issue. And that's what most Australians think. But Australia didn't react to that overt display of religiosity by stopping on the doorstep. But they did with Tony Abbott because he tried to legislate.
Can you give an instance of that, please?
Yeah, sure.
Well, for Tony Abbott, well, how did Tony Abbott push his own personal religious views?
So back when he was health minister, and he blocked the legalisation of medical drug 5U486, the morning after pill, to prevent conception for someone who has either had unprotected sex and doesn't want to take the risk of getting pregnant, they've had a condom burst during sex, and so therefore they don't want to have the risk of getting pregnant, so they go and get the morning after pill, RU486. Tony Abbott blocked that from being imported and used in Australia until Parliament overturned it. So he took an active, used his position in Parliament, in government, to enforce his own belief on all of Australia, instead of leaving it up to the individual.
Did Parliament have to pass that in the first instance, or was that an executive order? Because of fundamental difference.
No, so he, as health minister, decided it wasn't going to be allowed to be imported. It was an executive decision.
I asked, was it an executive decision or was it Parliament?
So it was an executive decision, and so Parliament overrode it.
Do you see secularism as such as being atheistic or neutral?
I mean, I'm sure there are people that don't see secularism as neutral. They see it as atheistic. But that's because they're coming from a position of privilege and seeing some of that privilege being taken away. And so therefore, if privilege is being taken away from me, it must be being given to someone else. And if it's not me, it must be those people that don't have a religion that are now getting extra privileges. That's not the case. I mean, we just have to look at the inequality of men and women. As women are getting more rights, more privileges, men aren't getting fewer. That's not happening. Men aren't losing privileges. All of a sudden, they're finding that, okay, now I have to actually compete on an even ground with a woman, and I'm not getting the job. Therefore, okay, the woman must have got it just because she was a woman, because they want to increase quotas. Doesn't ever consider the fact that, okay, no, you know what? I'm just a mediocre man, and that is a fantastic woman. And that's the same situation with some people seeing secularism as atheistic.
Okay, hey,
Sorry, I'm greedy. Do you see atheism as a force for good?
It's not a force for anything. I always come back to, it's just that one answer.
Okay, and look, it's almost 9 o'clock, so we need to wrap it up, but we'll have one last question, and I think...
it was just, so
Just changing the tack a bit. Sorry, Kevin, I haven't asked you any questions tonight. And
Yeah, well, he must be a lot more interested.
I mean, look at the time.
We know what you think.
So I wanted to ask along the lines of, you talked about humanism, and I think I know what that is because I've read about it and all that sort of stuff, and it's been around 150 years.
I mean, you can trace its roots all the way back to the Greeks.
Yeah.
But in its current form,
anyway, my question is, so tonight we heard Kevin put up the slides, and they were pretty good in terms of, so this is all the good things, humanism. Is there, and I'm not suggesting that you rattle them off, but is there and humanism has delivered that type of, we'll call it benefits, if that's the right thing. Is there you see where I'm going with it? Is there what's the list of humans?
What have the Romans done for us?
Yeah, right, yeah, exactly.
No, what is humanism? What has humanism done for us?
So I mentioned this to Kevin during the break. I would personally, and you can argue both ways, that a lot of the lists that Kevin did of Christians doing things which advance society occurred because Christianity was the predominant religion in Europe at that time. Europe was a cosmopolitan environment. So many major cities, culture centres, trading back and forth of ideas, all of that happening there, so close together, it would have happened anyway. Had, instead of Christianity coming in and taking over the Roman Empire, it had been Confucianism coming in and taking over the Roman Empire, for example.
The Goths and Visigoths and Vandals?
Yep.
Not until after.
Either way, whichever group came out on top, they still would have been contending with this cosmopolitan society where you could just go visit the next city over in a couple of days' time and hear about what was happening, go to a different country so easily and learn about what's happening there, take those ideas back and try them out, go into another country and try something out. So that whole environment, that location that was Europe, that is Europe, would have, I contend, given birth to all of that stuff anyway, whatever the overarching theology, religion, bureaucracy would have been at that time.
If I may, and I don't know you want to finish it up, maybe the next talk would be Christianity versus humanism, because actually that would tease out a little bit more. But anyway, that's up.
Okay, I think we'll have to call it quits there because it's gone 9 o'clock. Thank you everyone for coming and participating in this. Thank you Kevin and Scott for your addresses tonight, and it's given us all plenty to think about and good basis for discussion.